Between 2015 and 2020, Milwaukee dropped its street homelessness by 92%.
If you're going to be in public service, you might as well kick ass at it.
And that's one of the people who made it happen. And they kept it down after the pandemic, even when it was going up nearly everywhere else. But how? A revolutionary new model? No. They used Housing First, which is being used just about everywhere. Some big foundation grant? Not that either. They used pretty much the same federal and local tax dollars available in every metro in this country. So what did they do? The thing that nobody ever pays attention to. They simply organized their resources in a completely different way. If you're someone who wants to change things in this country or just transform something where you live, you're going to want to watch this video. It's part 2 of a series for American Civic Builders. And in this one, we're going to go deep on how power and money really works in this country, in an area we often completely ignore: state and local government, our local communities or metro areas. And in this video, you're going to see just how much your local civic architecture matters for actually getting things done. In part 1 of this series, we talked about how America is complicated. There are so many levels and divisions of federal, state, and local government, plus 2 million nonprofit organizations, a condition that I call civic sprawl, that achieving change can seem impossible. In that video, we also learned about the history of the Constitution and why this current state of affairs is the natural outgrowth of many of our most cherished values. So in this video, you're going to learn what to do about it. Through the story of Milwaukee, you will get a 3-part framework for civic transformation that will let you cut through civic sprawl like a knife and discover the right path to take to create whatever kind of change it is that you are after. But even if that's not you, if you stick around to the end, you might come away with some ideas about how America is designed, how it's doing, and what it's going to take to preserve and even deepen those fundamental constitutional values. Values we may need now more than ever. Hi, I'm Annalisa, an attorney who spent nearly 20 years working inside housing authorities, nonprofits, and foundations. I ran a $300 million federal housing program. I've advised donors on how to better use their private charity for public sector results. And I've seen what separates communities that solve problems from those that stay stuck. And what you're going to see in this video is a thing that nobody talks about: the hidden civic architecture that actually explains why initiatives like Housing First appear to completely fail in some cities but achieve huge change in others. So let's rewind to the year 2014 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Milwaukee had a pretty consistent level of homelessness that, despite spending millions of dollars, hadn't budged for years. That is, until County Executive Chris Abele walked into Housing Administrator Jim Matthey's office and posed a question that changed everything.
What would it take to do something big about homelessness?
Not reduce it by 5 or 10%.
But end it.
And that's really the beginning of the 3-part framework. Number 1, define question 0. What is it that you're really trying to solve? Number 2, map your civic ecosystem, meaning identify who else is in this space working on this problem. And number 3, learn your civic wallet. In other words, figure out where the money is to pay for your solution. And now we're going to break these down one by one. But before I go further, I want to shout out Tim Hashko and Don Sawyer, makers of the Beyond the Bridge documentary, whose footage I've used here and at the beginning of the video. They give the human story behind Milwaukee and other cities that successfully implemented the most widely researched and validated approach to ending homelessness.
Housing first, housing first.
Housing First. And I highly recommend you watch it or request a showing in your city. And if you did see it, this video is going to tell you a side of the story that they didn't cover: how to actually pay for it all. So getting back to question 0. Question 0 is the key question. It asks, what exactly are we trying to accomplish here anyway? It actually came from Herman Leonard, a professor at Harvard. And it's critical to get it right, because the way you form the question will tell you everything about how you have to approach the solution. And the way Matthey and Abele asked that question made clear what it was they were trying to do: attack the problem at scale. Not just do some feel-good charity or a photo op for an elected official. They really wanted to fix it. And if that's what you want to do, number 1, you've got to get exceptionally clear on what it is you want to change. And the folks in Milwaukee wanted to permanently house the hardest to house people. People who have been homeless for years. People with severe mental illnesses and addictions. Now that we're clear on that, the second thing is to quantify the problem. How many chronically homeless people are there? And in what geographic area? But then you've got to ask, what does the best research tell us about what actually works to help this specific problem? Because they're not focused on helping people who are down on their luck one time. They were focused on an intervention that works for the people who have been homeless for a long time, or multiple episodes, living in places not meant for human habitation. And thankfully, when it comes to this kind of specific thing, there is a well-documented intervention called Housing First. What it is the offer of permanent housing and optional services, even for folks with severe issues. Housing First was invented by Dr. Samson Barris, a clinical and community psychologist who noticed how frequently the same patients he was treating at New York's Bellevue Psychiatric Hospital were the same folks he passed by living on the street. The idea is so simple. Give those folks permanent housing first, without any barriers or hoops to jump through, like the prevailing model at the time required, and follow up with voluntary services. And you know what? It worked. Housing First has been implemented around the US and the world. It's widely studied, and it achieves 80% effectiveness when implemented with fidelity. Plus, it's cost-effective. When you think of the most chronic homeless folks, the ones who are high utilizers of other public systems like the ER and public safety, Housing First tends to cost about $30,000 a year, as opposed to over $100,000 a year when you totally impacts to all those other systems. Now, if we didn't have an established model with evidence behind it, we'd have to take a different approach. I'll link another video up above where you can dip a toe in that kind of water. But the next thing you've got to do for this situation is the math. What kind of inputs do you need to execute that model at the scale that you need to? Staff, outreach workers, housing units, the money for rent, mental health support, and so on. What do those inputs actually cost? Question 0 is the start. It allows you to get really specific about what you're trying to achieve, what's going to work, and what it will actually cost. Quick sidebar here. Some of you might be wondering, now, why are there so many people with severe mental illnesses and addictions living on the streets in the first place? Well, sometimes something really big and structural changes in this country, and if we're not paying attention, it's like we don't even notice that it happened. And in the 1970s and 80s, we really did take apart the old system of large state mental institutions. Take a look at how the number of state mental hospital beds dropped from 339 for every 100,000 people in 1955 to only 22 in the year 2000. And this was very important. I mean, those places were often terrible and way more restrictive than they needed to be. The thing is, we just never really replaced them with anything.
But Reagan screwed up a lot. He screwed up mental health in this country.
It's not like we just at some population level eliminated mental health and addiction challenges. There are simply a lot of folks in our population who need some kind of beefy temporary support to get stable or permanent help to get by, and they just don't have anywhere to go. We actually invented this arcane thing called permanent supportive housing, probably only known to industry insiders, but we never really built enough of it or funded it sufficiently. So a lot of people who need this sort of thing are in and out of jail, the ER, and are truly living in some of the most awful conditions in one of the richest countries in the world.
In addition to being the director of the Department of Corrections, I became a de facto director of a major mental health system.
And those are the folks that Matthew and Abley were trying to help. Not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it's better for everyone. Now, that's not to say we don't need other sorts of policy solutions to address the broader problem of housing affordability, but I'm just trying to help us get really specific here so you can see what they were trying to do. Now, imagine if you were stepping into Jim Matthew and Chris Abley's shoes for a minute. How are you going to make all this happen? Especially when you're probably vaguely aware of maybe 50 different agencies, public and private, in your metro area that all have something to do with homelessness, and they're not solving it yet. Well, that brings us to step 2. Analyzing your civic ecosystem. And this is a step you just have to take, whether you're a seasoned long-term administrator or you're stepping into this as a student, a board member, or a donor trying to get involved for the first time. Because you simply have to know how the little star you are fits into this broader constellation. Over and over, I've seen people, especially in nonprofits and philanthropy, jump into whatever they think the solution is without developing a clear understanding of the terrain, the state of play on the field. And those efforts are usually not bound to succeed. So here's how you do it. Imagine you're standing in front of a blank whiteboard. You're about to tackle this problem that matters to you. And you're going to fill that whiteboard with everyone and everything that might touch this issue. Who already serves this population? Housing providers, emergency shelters, mental health system folks. What about the courts that see these folks, the hospitals that treat them, the police who find them on the streets, the downtown businesses who want to help but don't know what to do? What about the people who fund this work? Foundations, government agencies, United Way, churches. What are the market forces influencing this problem? What are the regulations that are helping or hurting? Who is in charge of them? City council, state legislature, your senator? But just make sure you take the time to fill that entire whiteboard, because every single one of those institutions and players has knowledge, resources, connections, and power that could help or hurt your efforts. And you've got to talk to them, because that's the only way to really uncover the shape of your civic architecture. And more importantly, who has power over your civic wallet. That's my term for all the money we spend, state, local, federal, public tax money, and private charity, that buys us what we think of as public goods and services in the US. Because you gotta get a sense of what sources you could tap for your solution. And breaking all that down and learning how they work is step 3. I mean, this is the stuff we don't talk about in civics. We learned about separation of powers and federalism and all that, but where is all the money for housing and who's in charge of it? How do our local, state, and federal tax dollars work in this arena? What are they being used for? Who is accountable for them? And we learned about Alexis de Tocqueville, but how big are the local private foundations? What size grants do they make? What reasonably is the amount of money you could get your hands on to deploy towards a solution? And what are all the local nonprofits? What are they doing? How many folks are they serving? All of this can seem daunting, and you may want to throw up your hands and cry out for a more efficient form of government. But remember, as we saw in the first video in this series, America's civic complexity isn't a flaw. It's a feature born out of our deepest values. Our Constitution intentionally fragments authority, multiplies decision makers, and protects the right of communities to chart their own course. This design has given us extraordinary resilience, but it also means you need a real strategy if you are going to influence this diverse civic ecosystem and civic wallet. So don't throw up your hands, roll up your sleeves, and learn who does what and how it's all paid for. When I worked at a community foundation, which you can think of as sort of an umbrella foundation that helps many individual donors give away money, I'd often find myself making these very elaborate diagrams of the civic ecosystem and the civic wallet so they could find their exact point of leverage. It was an absolutely essential tool because it helped us figure out, is it actually that we've got enough local money to pay for a solution, it's just being deployed into programs that lack evidence? Or maybe some great program over here is actually doing the evidence-based model, you just have to 10x its capacity to make a dent. You can't figure out the answer to any of that without analyzing the civic ecosystem and the civic wallet. And for Milwaukee, to deliver housing first, they knew they would have to pull together millions of dollars a year. I mean, think about the cost of rent, the outreach workers to build trust and find these folks, the right mix of mental health and recovery services, times 200 people. That's not cheap. It's more money than any local foundation was going to be able to fund one time, let alone year after year. You know, they were going to have to look at using public taxpayer money, and that's for 2 reasons. I mean, if you watch this video, you'll see that public money simply dwarfs the capacity of any private resources. And also, why shouldn't we look at using our public money in a more effective way? And this is where you're really going to see the incredible secret sauce they had in Milwaukee that almost nobody focused on politics and government ever talks about: how your local government is designed. Because of all this decentralized power and local control the framers built into our system of government, there are a lot of individual power centers that control resources, and we have a lot of freedom to choose our structures at the local level, for better or for worse. To really see what I'm talking about, let's put the civic wallet where we can look at it. And it's even more helpful to compare and contrast, so let's look at 2 different communities: Toledo, Lucas County, Ohio, and Milwaukee/Milwaukee County, Wisconsin. We're going to look through the lens of public money for housing and the private. And we'll ask for what, how much, and who receives or controls it. Now, we're actually going to walk through the 6 main funding streams that the federal government, through the Department of Housing and Urban Development, is pushing into most American metros year after year. Now, here's what nobody really ever explains. The federal government sends a lot of money into every metro area, but communities have enormous freedom in who controls it and how it gets used. Now, to understand this, we're actually going to have to look at all those streams. All right, folks, I'm going to warn you that this is where we get technical. But if you really want to understand what I'm talking about and learn how power and money are really organized so that you can change the system, this is where you're going to start to find the answers. Now, if you work in government or in housing and you already know all this, you might want to skip ahead. But you should also ask yourself why this information isn't more common knowledge. Because here's the thing. Public finance professionals have largely failed to make their work understandable to the American public. And in a constitutional system built on informed people having opinions and exercising them through representation, that's not just a communication problem, that's a democracy problem. So I'm going to take the time to make some of this legible. Because if citizens are supposed to engage with how we're actually spending their tax dollars under this design, we have to stop hiding behind jargon, complexity, and excessive specialization. So let's start with Toledo, Lucas County, Ohio. This is the Continuum of Care money. It's a grant from HUD that goes to your local community to fund a comprehensive homelessness response. It was set up in basically the mid-90s, and the way it works is you basically have a local lead organization that puts together a plan for a local homelessness system. That organization basically runs its own local competition for projects that are focused on housing people, so not emergency shelter, but things like permanent supportive housing. This agency also ensures that there is an annual homelessness count. It runs things like a central intake system, an assessment process, and software that's linking all of the different shelters and housing providers. It allows you to know who you're serving how much and at what acuity level. So you take that plan and you send it off to HUD. Basically, HUD reviews that whole package. The local lead organization is sort of pre-vetting through a local lens, and HUD decides to award dollars based on how big the local need is, how compelling that total package is, and how well you're using an evidence-based approach like Housing First. So here, that community is getting about $4 million a year, spread over 17 different projects. That community's lead agency is a purpose-built nonprofit organization called the Toledo Lucas County Homelessness Board. But that lead agency can also be a unit of local government, a city department, county, and so on. Next, we have ESG. That's actual funding for emergency shelter. Here, it's about $640,000 a year, and it goes to the city. Now, this pot of money is supposed to get coordinated with your local continuum of care. And here, the city asks that continuum care agency to run a grant award program to give this money away. So it's arguably pretty coordinated. But next, there is home funding, which is for affordable housing supply. It can be used for everything from site acquisition to demolition to, in certain cases, temporary rental subsidy payments. This one is complicated, as is the entire arcane field of affordable housing development. It involves the IRS, a complicated tax credit regime. It brings in banks and investors, and state-level affordable housing finance agencies. Oh boy, I'd have to get into that rat's nest in a whole other video, but in this case, just know that the home dollars are $2.4 million a year, and they are controlled by the city. And then you have the most flexible funding of all, which is the Community Development Block Grant, which can broadly be used for community and economic development. And it gets used for everything, from summer youth programs to repaving the streets to facade grants to small businesses. And it certainly could get deployed to support homelessness outreach workers or very short-term rental assistance. Now, the way it works is some cities are large enough to get a chunk directly from HUD, and other municipalities get it indirectly through an award that first goes to the state, which is why you see two chunks here. Now we get to the even bigger ones, traditional public housing, where the government both owns and operates housing for low-income people, and the Housing Choice Voucher Program, aka Section 8, which is a partnership with private landlords that own the housing and the government that pays for part of the rent for low-income people. And both of these programs are administered by a local public housing authority. Now, I want to explain this one, because when I worked at a housing authority, I'd get calls from people saying, "Is this HUD? Is this HUD?" And well, no, it's not. The way this works is Congress in 1937 said, we've got to be able to inject housing some places where it's truly needed. They were doing things like building civilian worker housing for World War II and trying to deal with the fact that in some parts of this country, you still had a lot of people living in places that didn't have running water. So Congress said, hey, states, we've got some money for housing. If you agree to create another type of local government unit in your state code, we'll give you this money with some regulations around how you can use it. And you got the same general structure for Section 8, which came along much later in like the 1970s. So why does this matter? Well, it's a large pot of money, and well, local communities have a lot of choice in how these things are structured, how they can deploy this federal money to meet local needs. So for example, the Housing Choice Voucher Program, aka Section 8, is the single largest housing subsidy program in the nation. But it's not just one program. There are 3,600 local housing authorities in the country, and they each work a slightly different way. Local housing authorities can choose to set up their eligibility policies to help special groups like chronically homeless people or seniors. They choose how they'll actually structure their rental subsidies, which functionally dictates if somebody can use that voucher only in a poor neighborhood or they can take it to a really nice neighborhood so they can get their kids into a better school. They can run their programs dynamically, creating educational and economic opportunity for those they serve. Or they can choose to do the bare minimum. And critically for this video, local housing authorities can choose to apply for special voucher types that Congress makes available to help certain groups like disabled veterans. And remember when I talked about that thing called permanent supportive housing? Well, the local housing authority can actually allocate up to a certain percentage of its vouchers, usually 20 to 25%, to these special housing operators, usually nonprofits who build and operate this specific kind of housing. So when you're trying to solve street homelessness at scale, like the way Milwaukee was, you need these housing authority resources aligned with your strategy. And whether that's easy or hard depends entirely on your local civic architecture and whether or not the local housing authority is going to play ball. So in the Toledo, Ohio area, here you see a housing authority controlling about $15 million in public housing money and $30 million in Section 8 subsidy and overhead. That is an independent unit of government, and it makes its own decisions about everything I just talked about. So if you're putting together your Housing First initiative, you're looking to these big HUD streams to help you pay for some of the most costly pieces of the puzzle. But then you're also looking to other state, federal, and local government sources to cover the other pieces. A big one being mental health and addiction services for people who can't afford it, which in this community are funded through a combined pot of $30 million that comes through both federal streams like SAMHSA and a local levy. And these funds are managed by a quasi-independent mental health board set up in accordance with Ohio state law. And then we have another one, the social work support, like food stamps and other benefits. And of course, the workers that provide case management, which in this community totals about $45 million a year and happens to be funded through a county Department of Jobs and Family Services. But it's called Health and Human Services in other places. And of course, there are other private resources like the hundreds of service delivery nonprofits, United Way, the Community Foundation, the corporate sector, all playing a role. And I can't go into each of those or else this video would be 3 hours long, but let me know if you're interested and I can break those down in another video. But now we're getting to the important point. I want to contrast that with how all of these same streams of money flow in Milwaukee. Roughly the same amounts, proportionally speaking, same local flexibility, but watch what happens when we look at who controls them. Do you see a pattern? Do you see just how many of these are under Milwaukee County government? That's not an accident.
We are the only housing division in the country that are under a Department of Health and Human Services, and this was done very intentionally. So when we started our homeless program, the goal was to take all of these various federal programs and local funding, put them under one roof, really with the mission of serving the most underserved in our communities.
Milwaukee even has two housing authorities, one for the city and one for the county. But it's not just that. One of them actually is the county.
I'm the administrator of housing services, but also function as the executive director of the Milwaukee County Housing Authority, so that is separate from HACM at the city.
Contrast that with Toledo. 6 different organizations, 6 different boards, 6 different budget cycles. All of these independent centers of power that you have to get to agree about how to use their resources. And they certainly can. That's why you hear so many people talking about the importance of partnership and collaboration. But let's get real. This is about power. And when you need to put together public money fast to achieve a result, it's very helpful to have that critical mass of power and resources all consolidated under one roof. For example, if you need to reassign 3 social workers out of your team of 40 to serve your Housing First initiative, it's much easier if that's just a management decision at the county rather than having to knock on a whole other organization's door and asking if they'd please consider doing it. And of course, many times they do. In my various roles, I've been the person selling agencies on the reasons why they should say yes to all sorts of collaborations. The power of your question zero, the trusting relationships you build, and how well you tell a story can inspire people to collaborate of their own volition. And that recognition of agency is built into our American DNA. But other times, you're going along nicely with your initiative, and then all of a sudden, you hit a dead end. Just because somebody's got an ego, or simply has other plans for their budget. Political scientist Francis Fukuyama calls these veto points, and he argues that the U.S. has so over-optimized for separation of powers that it actually inhibits us from getting anything done, a point echoed by Ezra Klein in Abundance. But Milwaukee County chose differently. They put a critical mass of power and money in a singular structure that enabled them to efficiently reshape how their civic wallet was used. Here are a couple of their strategies. For example, they were able to deploy a significant volume of Section 8 vouchers for the chronically homeless because they could simply rewrite the Housing Authority policy to do that. They could provide dedicated mental health and addiction services because that's just another piece of a $250 million department within the county. They decided to create an in-house street outreach team run by the county so that they could handpick the workers they were trusting with their most important task, finding the hardest to house and getting them into a home. Because they had the resources amassed, they could enter master leases with landlords, where they could just directly lease 100 one-bedroom apartments, which enabled a homeless person to get into a home well before they could pass a credit check. And they also controlled all the community-level planning for affordable housing development. So they were able to look into the future and ensure they had enough of this specific kind of permanent supportive housing for their population now and as time went on. This tremendous amount of hidden consolidation and lack of silos in their civic architecture not only cuts through civic sprawl, but it makes it easy for the business community to get involved because they're not dealing with 20 different organizations. And even the HMOs chose to pilot an investment in housing. It was plain for the hospitals and insurers to see that an investment here would directly lead to cost savings in the form of reduced ER stays. And don't even get me started on the savings to the criminal justice system and the jails. All of that snowballed into this incredible result. Milwaukee breaking away from the rest of the nation during the pandemic and still having some of the best results in the country today. And how did this all happen? How did they achieve such a smart structure that enabled them to put the resources together and actually deliver results? Now, you might think it was all just the power of one single convener, like the county executive, Chris Abele, who brought everybody together and just restructured government around this singular goal. But the reality is much more complicated. The reason why the county actually had its own internal housing authority separate from the cities, which for years would not play ball, was just the result of a historical accident back in the 1970s. And the reason the county had its own housing division was actually the result of a set of scandals that plagued the county mental health department well before Chris Abele's time. This was taking place back when their county executive was Scott Walker, and he simply wanted to make the negative press go away. And that crisis created the opening that allowed a very young Jim Matthey and the then director of the Health and Human Services Department to create the housing division inside the county, which allowed them to move some resources around to restructure that internal housing authority so that they could align policy and money more comprehensively. And yes, County Executive Chris Abele did come along to inspire a higher level of collective action. He asked the key question. He set the table. He brought people together from different sectors. And yeah, he threw in a bit of money to really take this thing to the moon. But you can't ignore the fact that the foundation had already been laid incrementally over time, and without anybody really noticing except a few smart behind-the-scenes civic operators who knew how valuable it was to slash through some of that civic sprawl and consolidate what you can if you ever want to get anything done. So what can you take away from this story? Well, Milwaukee shows us that civic architecture matters. The way power and resources are organized locally can make or break your initiative. And you don't need Milwaukee's exact structure, but you do need clarity about your civic architecture, what you're trying to accomplish, what it costs, and who controls all the resources. That's what the three-part framework gives you. When you define question zero, map your civic ecosystem, and analyze your civic wallet, you start to see your options. You see who you need to influence to change how money gets spent. Sometimes that means building partnerships. Sometimes it means getting a grant to kickstart something. But sometimes it means asking whether the structure itself needs to change. But you just can't choose a strategy until you see the field clearly. As we learned in part 1, the US was designed with decentralized power and local control as features that would protect individual liberty and prevent tyranny. But that design demands something from us: active citizenship. The framers didn't build this system for passive consumers of government services. They built it for civic builders who take responsibility for shaping their communities. Milwaukee succeeded because seasoned civic builders understood they had the constitutional freedom to organize local power, and they used it. And at a time when power is consolidating at levels the framers never imagined, federal, corporate, and technological, maybe the antidote is remembering that real power in America still flows from the bottom up, from people like you, in communities like yours, doing the hard work of civic building. So use this framework. Get curious about your civic structures. Build common understanding with other civic builders. And remember, you have more power to change things than you think. In the next video, we'll see what happens when a community doesn't use this framework deliberately, and homelessness gets worse despite millions of dollars in investment. And we'll see what we can learn from that. So if you found this interesting, please like and subscribe and comment down below, and I'll see you on the next video.